No comment about.
So tonight what I'm going to do is talk about allies and comrades. And I'm going to argue that being allies is insufficient and we need to be comrades. And so there'll be three parts to my talk. First, I'm going to give a critique of the current discussion around allies and allyship. Second, I'm going to give an account of the comrade as a figure of political belonging, mode of address, and carrier of expectations for action. So that's my new project, and so I'm really interested in feedback on this because I'm trying to develop this idea. So this is very much a work in progress. So this, the second part is this account of the comrade, and then the third part of the talk will be a consideration of the power of the comrade under conditions of capitalist white supremacy. So, why the comrade? The first reason is that it flows out of work that I've been doing on communism as the horizon for left politics and on the party as the political form necessary for this politics. My wager is that a theory of the comrade helps here as it draws our attention to a generic figure of political belonging, one that attends to a relation mediated by a specific politics, typically one given by and through the party. The comrade is a figure for the relation between those on the same side, those who tie themselves together instrumentally for a common purpose. If we want to win, we have to win. And if we want to do that, we have to act together. Our actions are voluntary, but they're not of our own choosing. Comrades have to be able to count on each other, even when they don't like each other, and even when they disagree. The second reason I'm turning to the comrade concerns the challenge of organizing the challenge of organizing today, particularly with the current iteration of identity politics. The feminist slogan that the personal is political has morphed into the view that only the personal is political. The personal, what the individual experiences, feels, or risks, has become a privileged site of political engagement. Given neoliberalism's subjection of public and political practices and institutions to market demands, this isn't surprising. The problem is that the left has claimed as a victory the symptom of its defeat, the erosion of working class political power and the accompanying decay of its political parties. Now, when identity is all that's left, hanging on to it makes a kind of sense. As the sociologist Jennifer Silva discovered in her interviews with a number of US-based working class adults, the struggle to survive can become the basis of an identity imagined as dignified because it has to produce itself from itself. But attachment to identity is pathological. It's an attachment to a fantasy of wholeness or certainty, to the illusion of that pure sight that can guarantee that we are right, that we're on the side of the angels. But identities are themselves split, right? Contested. They're sites of class struggle. That someone identifies as a woman, as black, as trans, tells us nothing about their politics. Now, that identities are sites of struggle rather than grounds of struggle is clear when we consider allyship. For at least 5 years, there's been a very intense discussion going on in activist circles, social media, nonprofits, university campuses, over who can be an ally and what it means to be an ally. Generally, allies are privileged people who want to do something about oppression. But as is frequently emphasized, claiming to be an ally does not make one an ally. Allyship's not an identity. It's a process or journey. People have to work at it. Much of the writing and video work on allyship is thus instructional, right? It takes the form of like how-to guides or list of pointers, how to be an ally, the do's and don'ts of allyship. It's like eliminate the clutter books or tips for clean eating. So there are many, kind of like mini lifestyle manuals or techniques for navigating the neoliberal environment of privilege and oppression. Individuals can learn what not to say and what not to do. They can feel engaged, changing their feelings, if not the world. In the pieces on how to be a good ally that circulate online, the viewer or reader is addressed as an individual from a privileged identity who wants to know what they can do right now, on their own, and in their individual lives to combat racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression. The allies' field of operation is sometimes imagined as social media, right? The way to respond to homophobic or racist remarks on Twitter. It's sometimes imagined as professional interactions, like hire the marginalized or promote the oppressed. Sometimes it's imagined in terms of conversations at school or university, and sometimes, not often, sometimes street-level protests, right? You shouldn't dominate someone else's event. But more often, the allies' own individual disposition, attitude, and behavior constitute the presumed operational field. The how-to guide instructs the ally on how to feel, think, and act if they want to consider themselves as someone who is on the side of the oppressed. Their awareness is what needs to change. For example, the Guide to Allyship says that, quote, "To be an ally is to take on the struggle as your own. Stand up, even when you feel scared. Transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it. Acknowledge that while you too feel pain, the conversation's not about you," end quote. So here, allyship is a matter of the self, of what the self acknowledges, of the individual who stands alone, and of this single individual taking on a struggle that properly belongs to another. It's as if struggles were possessions, artifacts that individuals take on over and into themselves, all the while being urged to see these acquisitions as something to which they, the ally, have no right. At the same time, exactly what the struggle is, what the politics is, remains opaque, unstated, a matter of the correct feeling or attitude, or whatever the individual feels comfortable doing. BuzzFeed provides a further example. Quote, "How to be a better ally, an open letter to white folks." The text replies to a white person asking about allyship. And so the reply is, "Being a good ally often means not being included in the conversation because the conversation isn't about you. It's good to listen. If you feel uncomfortable and excluded because you're white, you should own those feelings," end quote. Again, allyship is a disposition, a confrontation not with state or capitalist power, but with one's own discomfort. To be an ally is to work to cultivate in oneself habits of proper listening, to decenter oneself, and become aware of the lives and experiences of others. Acting on privilege here appears as an interior act, an act of the self on the self. One's politics may be entirely in one's head. In this respect, allyship reflects the shrinking or decline of the political. The space for politics has decreased, yet the ally feels the need to act desperately, intensely, and now they're told to act in and on whatever is available, right? Social media and themselves. The process of becoming aware reiterates a key injunction of communicative capitalism. Educate yourself, Google it. Don't ask or burden the oppressed. The blog Everyday Feminism provides a list of 10 things allies need to know. Number 5 on the list is allies educate themselves constantly. It explains, quote, "One of the most important types of education is listening, see number 1, but there are endless resources, books, blogs, media outlets, speakers, YouTube videos, etc. to help you learn. What you should not do, though, is to expect those with whom you want to ally yourself to teach you. This is not their responsibility. Sure, listen to them when they decide to drop some knowledge or perspective, but do not go to them and expect them to explain their oppression for you," end quote. So learning is modeled as consuming information, not as discussion, not as coming to a common understanding, not as studying the text and documents of a political tradition. Self-education is disconnected from a collective critical practice, detached from political positions or goals. Criteria according to which one might evaluate books, blogs, speakers, and videos are absent. The individual ally has to figure it out on their own. In effect, there is punishment without discipline. The would-be ally is scolded and shamed even as the scolder is relieved of any responsibility to provide concrete guidance and training. Because let's be clear, telling someone to Google it is an empty gesture. once we recall that ally is actually not a term of address, right? It doesn't replace Mr. or Miss or Doctor or Professor. The term seems actually to designate and inscribe a limit. You will never be one of us, rather than mark a solidarity. The ally relation is between those understood to have separate interests, experiences, and practices. The 8th item on the list of things that allies need to know is, quote, allies focus on those who share their identity. The explanation is, beyond listening, arguably the most important thing that I can do to act in solidarity is to engage those who share my identity, end quote. So notice, identities appear clear and fixed, unambiguous and unchanging. Individuals are like little sovereign states defending their territory and only joining together under the most cautious and self-interested terms. Those sharing an identity are presumed to share a politics as if the politics didn't need to be built. Those who want to work for a politics other than one anchored in their own identity are treated with suspicion, mistrusted for their presumed privilege, and criticized in advance for the array of personal individual wrongs that preserve it, rather than, say, instructed on structures of oppression and systems of exploitation. This item 8 that I've been talking about tells us why allyship has such a hold in progressive circles. It maintains and polices identity, shoring up its weak and porous boundaries. It keeps our attention away from the fearsome challenge of confronting and abolishing the capitalist state, providing us with the small field of ourselves as a terrain where we might make a difference. So rather than bridging political identities or articulating a politics that moves beyond identity, allyship is a symptom of the displacement of politics into the individualist self-help techniques and social media moralism of communicative capitalism. The underlying vision is of self-oriented individuals, politics as possession, transformation reduced to attitudinal change, and a fixed, naturalized sphere of privilege and oppression. Anchored in a view of identity as the primary vector of politics, the emphasis on allies displaces attention away from strategic, organizational, and tactical questions and onto prior attitudinal litmus tests, precluding from the start the collectivity necessary for revolutionary left politics. Where the ally is hierarchical, specific, and acquiescent, the comrade is egalitarian, generic, and utopian. The egalitarian and generic dimension of comrade are what make it utopian, what give the term the capacity to cut through the determinations of the everyday, which is another way of saying capitalist social relations. Now, my claim regarding, now I'm going in the second part right now, the comrade part. So my claim regarding the egalitarian, generic, and utopian dimension of the comrade comes from Alexandra Kollontai and Maxine Gorky. In her writings on prostitution, sex, and the family from the early years of the Bolshevik Revolution, Kollontai presents comradeship and solidarity as sensibilities necessary for building a communist society. She associates comradeship with a feeling of belongingness, a relation among free and equal communist workers. Quote, in place of the individual and egoistic family, a great universal family of workers will develop, in which all the workers, men and women, will above all be comrades. Comrade points to a mode of belonging opposed to the isolation, hierarchy, and oppression of bourgeois forms of relation, particularly for Kollontai, those of the family under capitalism. It's a mode characterized by equality, solidarity, and respect. Collectivity replaces egoism and self-assertion. In Russian, the word comrade, tovarish, is gender neutral, so it replaces gendered forms of address. God, every time I drink water, I always feel like, that awful video of Marco Rubio, right, when he's dripping. But I can't help it, I'm like super thirsty. Okay, so that's right, so pathetic. Gorky. So Gorky has a short story from the early 20th century, just titled Comrade. The story testifies to the life-giving power of the word comrade. Gorky presents comrade as, quote, a word that had come to unite the whole world, to lift all men up the summits of liberty and bind with new ties, the strong ties of mutual respect, end quote. The story depicts a dismal, torturous city, a city of hostility, violence, humiliation, and rage. And in this city, the weak submit to the dominance of the strong. In the midst of all this miserable suffering, one word rings out: Comrade. And the people cease to be slaves. They refuse to submit. They become conscious of their strength. They recognize that they themselves are the force of life. In Gorky's story, when people say comrade, they change the world. His examples include the prostitute who feels a hand on her shoulder and then weeps with joy as she turns around and hears the word comrade. With this word, she is interpolated not as a self-commodifying object to be enjoyed by another, but as an equal in common struggle against the very conditions requiring commodification. Rather than isolated and alone, she becomes part of a collective, the many fighting for justice. Like Kollontai, Gorky associates the word comrade with freedom from servitude and oppression, with equality. Like her, he presents the comrade as opposed to capitalist egoism's exploitation, hierarchy, competition, and misery. And, like Kollontai, Gorky links comradeship to a struggle for and a vision of a future in which all will be comrades. So Gorky and Kollontai inspire what I'll call the first thesis of the Comrade. Comrade is a generic and egalitarian, and for communist and socialist, utopian figure of political relation. The egalitarian dimension of Comrade names a relation that cuts through the determinations given by the present. This aspect of Comrade comes through in the conclusion of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Fanon appeals repeatedly to his readers as comrades. At the end of the book, he says, "Come, comrades, the European game is finally over. We must look for something else." And in the very last line, "For Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new man," end quote. Comrade is a mode of address appropriate to this endeavor. It's egalitarian, generic, and abstract, and in the context of hierarchy, fragmentation, and oppression, utopian. Now, when I'm saying that for a communist, comrade is utopian, I'm using utopian in a really specific sense, one theorized super well by Kathy Weeks in The Problem with Work. Weeks presents the utopian form as carrying out two functions. She writes, "One function is to alter our connection to the present, while the other is to shift our relationship to the future. One is productive of estrangement, the other of hope. The first mobilizes the negativity of disidentification and disinvestment. Our present relations become strange, less binding on our sense of possibility. The second redirects our attention and energies toward an open future, providing," she writes, "a vision or glimmer of a better world." So, as a mode of address, figure of political relation, and carrier of expectations, Comrade disrupts capitalist society's hierarchical identifications of sex, race, and class. It insists on an equalizing sameness of those on the same side of a political struggle, rendering the equalizing sameness productive of new modes of work and belonging. The power of Comrade consists in how it negates old relations and promises new one. The joy of comradeship is the flip side or the bright side of discipline. So my wager is that a speculative, compositive account of comradeship, one that will distill common elements out of different uses of the word comrade as a mode of address, figure of belonging, and container for shared expectations. My wager is that this effort can provide a view of political relation that we actually need in the present. Comrades are more than allies trying to attune themselves to the experiences of the oppressed. They are those on the same side of a struggle for an emancipated, egalitarian world. So, who is the comrade then? As we will see in Greta Garbo's first scene in Ernst Lubitsch's 1939 Ninotchka, anyone but not everyone can be a comrade. Oh wait, we're not getting any sound. Just a second. Wait, crisis. Oh, I know why. There we go. I hope this is why. Wait, now I don't know how to start it again. No, that wasn't why. Damn it. Sorry. Oh no. Wait a minute. The crisis still is happening. Y'all, let's just not worry about it. I'll just tell you what's going on. All right, let's go back again. Okay, so in this video, you've got these three guys. They are now, they're Bolsheviks. They work for a trade association, but they've become all bourgeois in Paris. And Moscow is sending a comrade to straighten them out. So they're looking around. You know, we don't know what the comrade looks like. How are we supposed to know someone? You know, how are we supposed to know who the comrade is? So like, oh, maybe this guy is a comrade. He looks like a comrade. So they're like, oh, he looks like a comrade. And then we'll see what happens. Oh, no, he's not a comrade. No, not at all. So like, what are we gonna do? Right, we don't know. Oh no, how are we gonna know? So we're looking around. And then we're gonna have, yes, of course, Greta Garbo. What? Yeah. Like, could that be her? Oh my, and then she's like, you know, what is it, something Yashukova, and they're like, what? You know, how nice for Moscow to send us a lady comrade. If we had known, we would have brought you flowers. And just like, they're all saying like, comrade. And then now that's when he's saying, oh, we would have brought you flowers. And she's like, don't make an issue of my womanhood. We're here for work, all of us. And so let's see, now they're about to go to work. Now here comes the porter, and he's like, let me take your bag. And she's like, why? And he's like, well, you know, it's my job. And she's like, that's not a job, it's social injustice. And he has, and then his last line is like, well, it depends on the tip. So, okay, there we go. All right, so the thesis is that, thank you. So anyone but not everyone can be a comrade. Iranov, Bulyanov, and Kopolsky can't figure out who their comrade is by looking at them. Identity has nothing to do with comradeship. To make an issue of identity is uncomradely. It substitutes the specificity of a determination given by everyday capitalist society for the generic, egalitarian, and collective sense of comrade. The premise of comradeship is division, it's struggle. There are sides. But unlike Carl Schmitt's classic account of the political, in terms of the intensity of the antagonism between friend and enemy, comradeship doesn't concern the enemy. That you are not my comrade does not mean you're my enemy. You might be a bystander, an ally, politically disengaged, a co-worker, a member of my family. Comrade is a term of address that inhabits an ecosystem of relations. The fact of the enemy, of struggle, is the condition of comradeship, but it doesn't determine the relation between comrades. Comrades are those on the same side of a division. With respect to this division, they are the same. They recognize the same division, the same political horizon. So their sameness is that of those who are working toward the same political goal. To say comrade is to announce a belonging and the sameness that comes from being on the same side. Now, I want to explore a little bit more this emancipatory egalitarian kernel of the term comradeship, and it appears really clearly when you start to contrast the comrade with other figures of political relation. Right? So the relation between comrades is not the same as a kinship relation. One is not born a comrade. It's not the same as the relation between brothers and sisters, parents and children, spouses, cousins. My son may be my comrade, but when I add comrade, I am designating a new and separate aspect of our relationship. The term comrade inserts a political element, highlighting the fact that my son and I share a politics that exceeds our blood and kinship relation. Kin may and do disagree politically. We can be related by blood without sharing a politics. The comrade's not the neighbor. Living near someone does not make them your comrade. We may be part of the same locality, the same community, the same tribe, the same neighborhood, without being comrades. Comradeship does not designate a spatial relation or an obligation stemming from proximity or shared sociality. The comrade is not the citizen. Citizenship is a relation mediated by the state. Comradeship exceeds the state. It does not take the state as its frame of reference. Relations between those on the same political side are mediated by the party. One finds comrades all over the world. Comrades may oppose other citizens, as we see in state fear of communists as traitors, as those with loyalties to an organization other than the state. Finally, the relation between comrades is not the same as the relation between friends. In his reading of Aristotle on friendship, Jacques Derrida emphasizes the individual singularity of friendship. He writes, "One must prefer certain friends. Friends are chosen, selected on the basis of their excellence, their goodness and virtue. One can only have a small number of friends. There isn't time." Again, this is Derrida's reading of Aristotle. For Derrida, this counting, this quantification marks the becoming political of friendship. Friendship isn't originarily or necessarily political. Comradeship's egalitarian assertion, in contrast, is intrinsically political. Those on the same side are bound together in ways that sets them apart, that makes them a party. Collectivity replaces the individual singularity of friendship. Comradeship extends through intimate relations to stretch into relations with those with people we don't even know personally at all. Anyone can be a comrade, whether they like me or not, whether they are like me or not. Now, I have a third thesis, and the third thesis is that the individual, understood as a locus of identity, is the other of the comrade. This third thesis hammers home the distinction between comrade and ally. Allyship is premised on asserting and protecting identity. Comradeship supersedes identity. It's premised on the forwarding of a politics. As we saw in Ninotchka, sort of, an issue should not be raised of the comrade's womanhood. They all have work to do. The sameness that arises from being on the same side disrupts the supposition that birth, citizenship, proximity, or friendship constitute the basis of a politics. To be hailed as comrade is to be interpolated not as an individual, but as a member of a collective, right? As a political subject. My friend Oksana Timofeyeva emphasizes that in comradeship, identity vanishes. Timofeyeva gives the example of the masquerade used by Bolsheviks undercover. Anyone could be that, that could be anyone hidden under the mustache. The historian Ellen Schrecker provides a further example, a statement from General Herbert Brunel, who was the Attorney General under Eisenhower. Brunel's suspicions of communists were heightened because, in his word, quote, "It was almost impossible to spot them since they no longer use membership cards or other written documents which will identify them for what they are," end quote. Not only does Brunel iterate the identitarian logic of the state, its reliance on technologies of identification to track and contain, but he also signals the political utility of the generic. The unidentifiable can infiltrate and subvert, hide and slip away. The comrade undermines the state's ability to identify friends and enemies. Schrecker quotes Herbert Philbrick, who is an undercover informer. Philbrick writes, or says, "Anyone can be a communist. Anyone can suddenly appear as a Communist Party member, close friend, brother, employee, or even employer, leading citizen, trusted public servant," end quote. In all of Philbrick's examples, it's the generic comrade who appears, carried by an individual person, yes, but the one who appears could be one of many. It could be anyone. For anti-communists, the instrumentalism of comrade relations appears horrifying. Combined with the machinic impersonality and fungibility of comrades, The fact that relations between comrades are produced for an exterior purpose, that they are means rather than ends in themselves, seems morally objectionable. This objection fails to acknowledge the specificity of comradeship as a political relation, as being on the same side of a struggle. It omits the way political work focuses on ends beyond the individual, and so necessarily requires collective coordination. It presumes, or this criticism presumes, a totalizing politics that subsumes all relations, rather than recognizing an abstract politics liberated or alienated from specific social relations. And it contracts and contains the space of meaning into self-relations, as if the abstracted generic relations among those faithful to a political truth could only be the result of manipulation. We have to reject the bourgeois fantasy that intimacy depends on personal disclosure, individual experience, or the way a singular person feels about people and events. There are other intimacies of common work and shared purpose, right? Making the banners, planning the action, knocking on doors, handing out flyers, carrying the flags. Now, in the interest of time, I'm just going to give a very quick remark about the fourth thesis on comradeship, which regards the discipline of comradeship. And this disciplining dimension, this disciplinarity, follows from the first three theses. The expectations that comrades have of themselves and each other constrain individual action and generate collective capacity. I think of these as disciplines of desire that produce the practical optimism necessary for revolutionary political work. George Orwell, in Homage to Catalonia, says that, quote, "Revolutionary discipline depends on political consciousness, on an understanding of why orders must be obeyed. Discipline is voluntary. Comrades choose it. The explanation for a given task, the generation of a shared understanding of its importance, is one of the ways that equality replaces hierarchy. If we're on the same side, if we share the same goals, we have to coordinate our actions to realize these goals. We teach each other and discipline ourselves because that's what political action requires." Now, I'm going to go into the third section. The last section. This is going too fast. Let's go back here. Now, once or twice, and I've given versions of this talk, like the first part, now not this last part, the last part's new, it's responding to criticisms I've gotten. I get a question which is, isn't the comrade really white? Or isn't the comrade also male? I'm not going to address the male part, maybe come up in the Q&A. And at first I started thinking that this was a completely bizarre question, right? That it proceeded as if black people and people of color have never been comrades. The question seems to omit histories and presence of struggle, like China, Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, Algeria, Angola, Palestine, South Africa, Afghanistan, Iran, Philippines, to mention just a few places. It seems like the question of, like, wait a minute, isn't the comrade white, completely neglects the anti-colonial and international dimension of the struggle for black liberation. Now, over the past decades, there has been a huge and important body of work here. And so I'm just going to mention a few names: Carol Boyce Davies, Barbara Foley, Yasuhiro Katagiri, Robin D.G. Kelly, Minka Makalani, Eric McDuffie, Mark Nason, Mark Solomon, Mary Helen Washington, to mention just a few people. There's also memoirs. Again, a very partial list: Angela Davis, Harry Haywood, Hosea Hudson. There's document compilations, a new one from Paul Heidemann that's really helpful. But yet racism and anti-communism work to expel this body of knowledge, to prevent it from registering in its truth and complexity. Racism and anti-communism both operate with caricatures of race and communism, as if they were unities rather than complex, heterogeneous, and changing multiplicities. But I still want to push further and take the criticism seriously, right? So, this criticism like, oh, maybe the comrade's really white. And I think we can break it down into two suspicions. First, that black people are not or cannot be comrades with each other. Second, that blacks are not or cannot be comrades with whites. The first suspicion implies that the politics of those ascribed to the same racial category is determined by that category. The supposition of racial kinship, brothers and sisters, occupies the entire political imaginary as if there were no political divisions between those who belong to the same racial category. Now, clearly that's wrong. There have been and continue to be political differences among black people, among people of color. Questions of separatism and assimilation, acceptance or rejection of capitalism, the strategies and tactics of liberation just scratch the surface of the politics dividing people ascribed to the same racial identity. For those in Marxist-Leninist political formations, comrade has been a term of address, sometimes accompanying the familial language of black nationalism in the black church, and sometimes replacing it. The second suspicion is that blacks cannot be comrades with whites, that comradeship is a ruse, a trick, a dirty game that subordinates black interest to white interest. This concern appears throughout the history of socialism and communism in the United States. I should add here that US communists in the early 1930s took this to heart. Mark Solomon gives the example of the instructions a party organizer gave to a section he visited in 1932. The organizer told the group that Negroes had been betrayed perennially by whites seeking their support. Quote, "What every communist must do is to be willing to die in defense of any Negro's rights. And it doesn't have to be anything flamboyant or very important. Any insult, and there are plenty, directed by a white person against a Negro is reason enough for a communist to react, to slap his or her face, hit hard, and if you be killed, that's all right too, because without the Negro people, we are only treading water as far as making the revolution in the US," end quote. In addition to the concern that whites will subordinate and betray blacks, and thus can't really be their comrades, another concern also appears as well, namely that the black bourgeoisie or middle class, the black elites, advance their own interests by delivering a pacified, cooperative black lower class over to white law. Now, if we look specifically at CPUSA, right, I'm really thinking about the early 30s, work of historians over the last several decades have exposed the lie behind claims that the CP only engaged in black liberation struggles for its own ends. Robin D.G. Kelly, Mark Nason, Mark Solomon, and others present a view of blacks and communism that rejects the scene of manipulation, disillusionment, and betrayal, end quote, that was from Nason, that animates the writing of Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and Harold Cruse. For a time, the CP was the leading interracial organization in the fight against white supremacy in the US. Adopting the Black Belt Thesis at its 6th Congress in 1928, the Comintern pushed the party to eliminate white chauvinism in the party and make the Negro question an organizing priority. And this was at a time when there were real dangers to interracial organizing in the Jim Crow South. These conditions, class struggle under white supremacy, illuminate the power and promise of the comrade as a figure for a political relation liberated from the determinations of specificity. And I'm going to illustrate this point via the Communist Party's scandalous Black Belt Thesis. And I say scandalous because the CP line that blacks in the Black Belt of the US constituted an oppressed nation with a right to self-determination is so often denigrated as out of touch with reality, as dogmatic, as ludicrous, as impossible, etc. Right? Cedric Robinson makes this argument, C.L.R. James dismisses it as well. Right? And of course there were even party members, black comrades, who did not initially agree that US blacks constituted an oppressed nation. In his memoirs, Harry Haywood, the primary force behind the Black Belt Thesis, sets out the stakes of the debate. So now I'm going to set out this debate. Now, according to Haywood, those who viewed blacks in the US as an oppressed racial minority thought that any hint of black nationalism was reactionary, a diversion from the primary struggle of organizing blacks as workers. For them, proletarian struggle was the sole revolutionary struggle against capitalism, end quote. Haywood argued that this position failed to grasp the revolutionary nature of national liberation struggles, which Lenin had already articulated. Even worse, it failed to provide a position from which to combat white chauvinism in the party and among the working class. It perpetually, again, the acceptance of that race is the primary operator and that we need to make sure that the proletarian revolution is the only revolution that counts. Haywood argued that this perpetually and necessarily subordinated race to class. And Haywood was particularly concerned that his black U.S. comrades, which included his brother Otto Hall, he was concerned that they separated racism from its socioeconomic roots, reducing the struggle for equality to a movement against prejudice. To emphasize race rather than nation was, quote, to downgrade the revolutionary nature of the black struggle for equality, end quote. In contrast, the self-determination line, Haywood argued, quote, established that the black freedom struggle is a revolutionary movement in its own right, directed against the very foundations of U.S. imperialism, with its own dynamic pace and momentum, resulting from the unfinished democratic and land revolutions in the South. It places the black liberation movement and the class struggle of the U.S. workers in their proper relationship as two aspects of the fight against the common enemy, U.S. capitalism. It elevates the black movement to a position of equality in that battle, end quote. So with this line, the CP would no longer make the mistake of subordinating the black struggle to the class struggle. Instead, the party would have to educate white workers about the revolutionary role of the black liberation struggle. As an article in the Daily Worker instructed, it is the duty of the Communist Party of the USA to mobilize and rally the broad masses of the white workers for active participation in this struggle, end quote. White comrades would have to make the black struggle their own. Anything less would be a betrayal of the revolution. So against those who treated black self-determination in the Black Belt as a formula for separatism, Haywood demonstrated its function in building unity. The class consciousness of white workers could only be race consciousness, right, white chauvinism, if they were not fully committed to the abolition of race hatred, Jim Crow, lynching, prejudice, and even indifference to the Negro struggle. Within the party, race prejudice would have to be weeded out and eliminated, fought with the utmost energy. As Mark Solomon observes, the self-determination line committed the party to fighting for the rights of blacks, quote, to be free to control the political and social lives of their communities, end quote. At the same time, it redefined the conception of black-white cooperation on the basis of new power relationships among equals, end quote. Comrades had to see themselves from a new perspective, not simply that of equals on the same side of a class struggle, but as equals on the same side of the black national liberation struggle. The Daily Worker noted that, quote, every member of the party must bear in mind the bitterness and distrust of the oppressed, colonized, and weak masses toward the proletariat of oppressor nations. The party instituted practices to confront white chauvinism, a campaign of self-criticism, the cultivation of black leaders, mass public trials, expulsions. Solomon calls it a frenzy of struggle for equality and black liberation. Some organizers in the U.S. South criticized purges of racially prejudiced whites, but the party took the view that even if the effect was political isolation in the South, any concession to segregation would validate racism and sacrifice blacks' trust in white radicals. So to conclude, I've offered the comrade as a generic figure for the political relation between those on the same side. Characterized by sameness, and this figure is characterized by sameness, equality, and solidarity. What does this mean under conditions of racial capitalism, of a capitalism anchored in white supremacy? It means the active confrontation with and rejection of these conditions in a recomposition of equality and solidarity. The CP's commitment to Black self-determination in the Black Belt exemplifies this vision of comradeship. It was utopian, a scandalous insistence that a large area of the southern United States belonged to African Americans because they built it, their work made it, their historic experience of capture on the ships under the lash, their re-enslavement, lynching, and Jim Crow engendered a national psychology that expressed itself as a collective longing for freedom. The Black Belt slogan refused to let this experience and this longing be subordinate to class struggle or reduced to the abolition of discrimination. The whole Jim Crow capitalist system had to come down. Black liberation, Black self-determination is revolutionary, and every communist must fight for it. Further, that anyone but not everyone can be a comrade has to mean that race doesn't determine who is a comrade. This demands the elimination of racism or white chauvinism. For a while, the CP was feverishly invested in this process in ways that, quote, sometimes degenerated into fantastic accusations, and in ways that were sometimes manipulated in intra-party machinations. It also happened that the frequent and repeated accusations, trials, and expulsions gave rise to the sense that racism would never be eradicated from the party. Yet, as the philosopher Alain Badiou reminds us, justice and superego are intertwined in the subjective political process, right? They're intertwined in the active work of comradely discipline. Our expectations of ourselves and each other are high. Comrade is a term of address and carrier of expectations for action. Just as the party is a form for political struggle, so is comrade a form for relations between those who share a politics. It's not risk-free. It's not a magical solution to all the problems facing the left, but it is the only form through which these problems might be solved. Anything less dooms us to competition, individualism, cynicism, and melancholia. To be a left at all, we have to be comrades. Thanks. All right, so maybe let's see if I can turn the lights on. No, I don't know. You can tell I'm a master with technology here. Okay, cool. So you want to talk or?
So does anybody have any questions?
Questions, comments?
Comrade Therese.
Yeah.
No, I was Facebooking your talk. No, I appreciate very much your critique of allyship in favor of comradeship. And also, anyway, so my question is, so you talked a bit about kind of, I guess, white responsibility to Black comrades, right? Or the conditions by which whites can be comrades of Blacks. But what about, so I think that the critique of the comrade as white is about kind of how does the Black person be a comrade to white people given all of the histories of Blackness, right? So what is the responsibility, the ethical or the comrade, the responsibility of the person who's racialized as Black to be a comrade? Do you just kind of let it go, right? Do you, so what is it like, what is the materiality of that, right? So what does that look like? What is the actually existing sort of responsibility of comradeship between the racialized and white comrades?
So that is configured within a party, right? It's not an abstract ethics. Absent a commitment to to a shared politics, absent being on the same side, there's not one, right? I'm not making some kind of big ethical thing. I'm talking about within, essentially within a party. I'm a little okay with fellow travelers as part of the formation, but it's not going to be abstract in that same way.
and white women and the ways in which there's the social gatherings in Communist parties was alienating for primarily black, like, women comrades. So in that situation, like, that's not abstract, that's a real
Yeah, so what's,
issue
I
on
was
the same side. So how does one
Okay, so what's super interesting about that example is what Claudia Jones does is appeal to comradeship as a way to criticize the social actions of those within the party, right? It's not like she's saying that outside of the party. She's saying that within the party, that you essentially, white women who are not being mindful of their black women comrades, and black men who are not being mindful, and white men who are not being mindful, you guys aren't treating the black women as comrades, right? You guys are not acting in a way that is solidary or equal or even generic. In fact, you're showing forms of chauvinism. So they had a set of norms and values that they could appeal to that were encapsulated within comradeship there. Right? That's how come she can make the argument, is because she's in the party and she can appeal to their common understandings of what it is to be a comrade. That will change. It's not going to be the same in every party all the time, and it's not always the same in the Communist Party. You know, in the latter part of the 30s, they got rid of the black belt line, they stuck away from it, they became a little bit too accommodating with sort of a bourgeoisie, but yeah.
So, help me understand what role the party is playing in understanding, like, why we should address each other as comrades. If you look at, like, within, or arguably to the left of maybe, like, more liberal social justice types, those criticisms of allyship, so the people that say we should be accomplices or something, it sounds at least in part like what you're going for, right? So we shouldn't be allies because we should see ourselves as opposed to the same thing, and so on and so forth. That's more or less how the argument goes. So how is it the party thing that's the difference between what you're saying and that, or is it something else?
It would be the party as the difference, right? So I'm not saying that everything is great if we all just, leave the room calling each other comrade, right? That's nothing, right? I mean, that's nothing. That's why I emphasize there's three aspects of it. It's a term of address. Oh, great, now my Facebook, that's not supposed to happen. Let me just unplug all this, because I have all my porn, no, I'm not. Wait, I don't know. Yeah, so it's a term of address, a figure of relation, a relation between those on the same side, and a carrier of shared expectations. And one of the huge problems with all of this sort of general thing, are we going to say allies or accomplices, blah, 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 is nobody knows who the hell they're talking to. They're talking to this mass disparate bunch of whatever in social media with no shared expectations. So that's another reason. So that it's the three things together that I think we need to be mindful of, and actually, it's supposed to be an argument to make people return to the party. Yeah.
Well, I think for me, I don't know, I also think that capitalism is also a utopian project. So I think making that differentiation between your utopia and what a capitalist utopia would mean, right? That they're making that distinction. I think that's kind of why, utopias are always about the end of history, right? So
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a sense in which it's the end, utopia means no place, right?
That's why I'm really specific in using Kathy Weeks' understanding of utopia. She develops it in a lot of detail in the book, The Problem with Work. Right? It's a very long and interesting chapter. And it is just not going to be the same thing as just saying this no place. There's two aspects. There's a disidentification and a disinvestment from the sort of current, I'll call them the current determinations of an oppressive hierarchical society. And then there's the opening to something new. Those are the two key parts that she gets from a close reading of utopian literature. So it's not the same thing as a capitalist utopian or a utopian is no place.
And she will talk about it herself tomorrow at 2 p.m. Jet City Improv, 55th and University. Revitalizing Utopia. 2 hours of investigation into that question.
Yeah, you can finish it.
So, to finish my question, it wasn't until you kind of mentioned that your utopia is actually really about multiplicity. It's about being able to occupy like multiple subjectivities at the same time, right? So as I'm listening to your talk, I'm like, there is something that like I don't want to give up about like I don't want to give up the word queer like in exchange for the word comrade, right? But actually what you're talking about is like a set of multiplicities in which you can occupy both those subjectivities at the same time. So, but like you kind of mentioned at the end, like you wouldn't really want to give up. You would like melancholia would be something that you wouldn't want the left to kind of be a part of. But isn't there something in the sense that like a connection between melancholia and community in a certain sense, in which like especially thinking about ethnicity, that melancholia and ethnicity is about like a search for like an origin, right? Like an origin that may not exist, but it's something that binds you together. Like I think there's something kind of like a affective like thing about community that you wouldn't want to give up. Like I don't know, like I wouldn't want to. For example, like the African American community isn't just a reaction to their like shared oppression. There's actually something like affirmative about that like maybe people wouldn't want to give up in search for like the comradeship, right? Like is there something where we can kind of like restore that or like keep that kind of like affirmative, affective kind of relationship you have to your like your community, I guess?
So I got a bunch to say on this one. So first, one of the things that's super exciting, you know, in Chinese, the word comrade is tongji, which is also their same word for queer. And that's really kind of wonderful because they're emphasizing the sameness there. So I like that commonality. Also, in the United States, at the very end of the 19th century, there's a publication called The Comrade, which is really, everybody's really infatuated with Walt Whitman's account of comradeship in his poems that are celebrating same-sex, men's same-sex relation. So there's a nice sort of overlap between queerness and comradeship, particularly in this sort of, it's a little too mystical for my taste, but it's a kind of affirmation of the solidarity and closeness of comrades. So on the queer side, you don't have to give up anything. I think that overthrowing capitalism and going into a communist society, to my mind, that's more important than embracing melancholia. And and so, I mean, people want to embrace melancholia, that's fine. Do that. We won't be comrades. I'm not going to kill you. But I think that it's not the same politics, right? The politics I'm talking about is a politics of people on the same side of a political struggle who recognize what it means to try to act politically as a collective. And it does take discipline, it does take some kind of sacrifice. It's not the same politics for everyone. That's why revolutionary parties tend to be relatively small.
When Pinochet took power September 1173, there was a whole series of things that they banned. And one of the first things they banned was the word compañero. And that has a huge kind of emotional history for the 3 years before. Allende was known as the compañero presidente. If you listen to the music of Victor Jara or Quilapayún or Iti Limani, you'll see the invocation to compañeros, compañeros and compañeras. It's almost part of the music and the air one breathed in Chile for those 3 years, of which I was there for the last month, but it was still alive even then on trains with people who got together. And it's really it had an effective component. What's interesting now is this went beyond a party because it was supposedly a unity of parties, several parties. Now, whatever its political success, it still lingers in the air after Chile was subjected to this kind of radical surgery into atomized individuals, which even involved bringing Opus Dei down to run all the educational schools there. And all that one has left of that age are, when people get together and say compañero allende, and everybody says presente. But it's just almost the whole experience has stuck to those words, compañero and compañera, and when I hear them, it definitely makes me melt for a moment in a little way, and so what I would then add is, interestingly enough, it's not a gender neutral word like comrade.
Yeah.
It was divided into compañero y compañera.
And in some languages, let's say in German, there's Genosse and Genossinnen. Genosse. I'm going to get my, Genossinnen. Oh, I was right the first time. Good. Okay. Yeah. So it's not in not every language is it gender neutral, but in the Russian, it's particular. The gender neutral aspect of it is particularly powerful, and Kollontai mobilizes that really effectively as she's trying to break down and go against the bourgeois familial relation. So yeah, it's not the endings of the term do change depending on some languages. Yeah, for sure. On the affective part is really strong. And it's strong in a bunch of different. You can find examples of people talking about being called comrade and how meaningful it is for them. I was giving a version of this talk a few weeks ago, and a woman from Pakistan came up and she's like, I remember the first time I walked into a party meeting and they greeted me as comrade. She's like the feeling of warmth that enveloped me was so strong and great. Frank Wilderson, in his book Incognito, talks about when Chris Hani, who is the head of the armed wing of the ANC, when he first said comrade to him, he said he felt like a child. He was embarrassed about it, but the feeling was so strong.
Can I add to that? The moment also at the beginning of the film called The Case of the Grinning Cat by Chris Martin, which starts off on the steps in Potemkin, where we hear the voice of Simone Signoret telling about the first time she saw Potemkin in the movie theater, and the moment when the mutinying sailors said to the officers, "Comrade," and they didn't fire, and then let's loose a montage of linked arms, which runs for 5 minutes with the music of Luciano Berio, which is one of the greatest evocations of comradeship in the 60s that you'll ever see.
Great. Yeah.
So I have two questions. One is about the identity that you mentioned so many times. So I was wondering what is your definition of identity in this case, especially in relation to citizenship? Because when you have this slide about the comrade in terms of kin and the neighbor, it seems like the idea of citizenship, you're looking at it through this identitarian lens, which to me is problematic because I see myself, my citizenship status was alien, so now I'm not alien. So I hope to be comrade one day, but after this presentation, I actually have to question myself about my comradeship or my relationship to the left as a whole, because if that's the case, I would like to step back a little bit. Like as Hannah Arendt says, sometimes revolution is just not basically overthrowing the power, but changing the power from one mode to the another mode. And for the people who are already suppressed, they will be at the same place. So I think it has this homogenizing quality. So for me, as the person who identifies with the left, I would like to step back a little bit based on this.
So yeah, there's definitely a homogenizing quality, right? I'm emphasizing that the homogenizing quality comes from those who are on the same side. It's you're the same with respect to your politics. Right, and that's the measure of the sameness right there. With respect to citizenship, when I was talking about citizenship and this identitarian logic, it has to do with the way the state wants people to have particular identities, that it lets it locate you and track you. You have your passport, and all of the ways that your passport would identify you as by your gender, your eye color, your age, your height, your weight, right? It's a very specific kind of attaching of citizenship to a specific identity that is part of the thing, is one of the reasons that I'm rejecting, I'm emphasizing the separateness of comradeship from citizenship. As a political theorist, I also am. I think that Hannah Arendt was a terrible mistake for the left, that people never should have gone in the direction she set off, and that citizenship ties our political imaginary to inclusion within a repressive state form, and we should be against that.
How do you identify yourself?
Pardon?
How do you identify yourself?
As a communist?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things that perhaps relate to some of the questions that were asked. It seems to me, and first of all, thanks for a very thought-provoking presentation, it was great. It seems to me that perhaps, and I think this would accord with what you're saying, I think that the ability to call one another comrade is a result of a process. It's a result of a long process in which you've actually managed to create and articulate a common project in which everybody feels a part, in which the specificity of different people's situation, whether it be of class or gender or race, has been accounted for rather than ignored, and therefore has created a genuine inclusivity that allows people from different standings in society to call each other comrades without any problem, genuinely meaning it. So it will be a result of a process. It's not something you can start off with.
Right, I'm emphasizing it within a party and belonging to a politics where you're on the same side. And that's why I said we can't just all start calling us comrades, that's going to change everything. So the thing is that when I hear you saying is this process in this vague location rather than within a specific political formation that actually does the work of people having to study the material, go through the candidacy, go to the meetings, do the work, right, repeatedly. That it's not an abstract, yes, but it's not, it is a process, and it's a process within a political formation, right? In my sense,
You don't have to convince me
okay.
about party.
But one of the things that I find as
I agree with you.
okay, one of the things that I find as a political theorist that often happens is that everybody wants to talk about all sorts of this process and that process, and then when you start to say where's the process located, everyone's like, oh no, don't hem me in here, don't discipline me. So that's what I'm. That's not your view. That's what I hear a lot in political theory. Yeah.
So, and not naming names, but there are locally left-wing so-called Marxist parties that everybody's a comrade when they walk in the door. And there's a little bit of an artificiality to that in my experience. It's kind of like, I don't know, it doesn't have the content that I would hope it would, that you've talked about. But I have a different question, which is Thesis 3.
Mm-hmm.
Your Thesis 3, if I recall, had to do with the antinomy between individuality and comrade.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing that I recall that. But anyway, there's an issue there for me that I think needs to be elaborated. There's a sense in which the individual in communism, I believe, has the potential to be fully actualized or developed, even though that individual is part of the collective. That individuality cannot be developed under capitalism. The individual is stunted under capitalism, if not killed outright. But there is the sense of the way it was portrayed in Thesis 3, the way it was written, it was a sense that individuality has to be sacrificed to the point where it goes into that stereotype of, well, communism, everybody dresses the same, they all walk down in an aisle the same, they're all goose-stepping in the same way. So I'm sure you don't mean that, but the question becomes, how do you develop or elaborate on the question of the relationship between the individual and the collective?
So first, I want to be really clear. I'm not talking about the flourishing of the individual under communism, right? I'm talking about what it is to fight for a politics, what it is to be in a party, and that I think that it is absolutely necessary, particularly on the left, to stop worrying about all of the flourishing of their individuality if they say they want, or if we say that we actually want to, overthrow capitalism or transform the system. If you do that, then you have to work with other people, which means you can't do everything you want all the time. Right? That's what I'm trying to get people to focus on, is what it is to be involved in the struggle rather than worrying about the end point. It means like you do stuff you don't want to do, right? You go to meetings when you're too tired, right? You suck it up when when you don't exactly fully agree with the way things are going, and realize, well, there'll be something else next time. We learn every time. We learn every time. Pursue a politics, pursue a strategy, pursue an action. If the action I want to do isn't the one the group wants to do, is this a disaster? No, it just means the group wanted to do this, and we'll see afterwards, was it the right thing to do or not? Right? But you have to do stuff you don't want to do, and we forget that it's crucial to put aside the individual preferences. That's what I'm trying to argue for. And I actually think that there is a lot of power in the emphasis on, you're like, oh, when everybody looks the same or something like that, or the stereotype of images under communism. It's powerful when everyone's wearing a similar T-shirt. It's powerful when everyone's got on a beret. It's powerful when you've got 50 people with red flags, right? That's.
Isn't it also problematic in a way?
No.
You don't think it's problematic?
Nope.
Okay. I'm not. The concept that everybody wears the same T-shirt and has the same beret on and is marching in the same direction is good in a way for the overthrow of capitalism, but it's also good in a way for developing the Marines. And so I'm not sure that that's the same, that we all want to go in that direction.
War. I mean, we do need to fight ultimately. So yes, we do need to act sort of like a military. I mean, just being frank, if we're really serious about overthrowing capitalism, they're not going to let us take it just, without a fight. So we kind of do need to. I think that's why I think Comrade is what soldiers call each other in war, and that's. My idea of Comrade was that we are in this common class war, and we have a common enemy also.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Comrade in Arms is one of the formations of the term comrade. It's not the only place where it comes from, but it is an important one. That's one of the reasons that in German they prefer Genossen and use Kamerad for keep it as the military connotation. Italian, for the most part as well, but not always, right? It's not quite as strong, but because the military connotation sort of sometimes pushes it into a sort of fascist direction. But the interesting thing is, even the German Social Democratic Party in the early years said Genossen as a separate, right, as a way to have a separate terminology from the one that was going to be completely sort of the semi-militarized. For Tovarish in Russian. But actually,
Oh, I was just wondering, do you know, did the KPD use Comrade?
No, KPD used Genossen.
Oh, they did.
Yep. There's something else. There's an interesting debate that happened in Russian, like in the early 90s after the defeat of the Soviet Union, over the etymology of Tovarish. And it's totally politicized. These etymology books are like fighting with each other. So the kind of cynical capitalist ones are like, oh, Tovarish comes from the word tovar, which is a good made for sale or commodity. And the implication was, if you scratch a comrade, what you'll see down as anybody's available for a price. And they were totally trying to stain Tovarish to make it seem like it never had any promise. Well, other people were like, this is crap. This is not true. It comes from this much older word that has to do for the tents used by soldiers in common encampments, which actually is much closer to the other etymologies where it comes in most of the Romance languages, where it has to do with this, the tent or the dwelling that soldiers were using. And in Italian, though, it's those who shared a hotel room, or not a hotel room, but who shared a room when they were travelers. Though the German Genossen is neat because it comes from an early word like Genozzo or Genuzzo, which has to do, it's Genoz, it has to do with shared enjoyment, which is actually kind of wonderful. Genießen, yeah, but there's a much older anchor in there. Okay, fun with etymology. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, I really liked your talk, and I think it's the whole thing about allyship and moving away from that is really good. And I think it's based on the idea that solidarity, we have common interests, that it's in the interest of the whole working class to fight against racism, sexism, etc. But I wanted to take up the black belt thesis. I think that in the early 20s, the Communist Party was pressed by the Comintern to really take up black liberation in the U.S. But that was before the black belt thesis, and that really only came about in 1928 as the party was being Stalinized, right? And it was never actually, the Communist Party never actually carried it out in the sense that, like, Scottsboro.
That's actually, I don't think that's true.
Really, the focus was really against racism, and there's no, I mean, the central focus on the fight against racism is absolutely important for any kind of left-wing movement, but I don't think it has to be based on on identifying blacks as a national minority or whatever. It can be the generalized fight against racism, and today especially that's true because the demographics of the U.S. have shifted so much since that time in terms of people being spread out all over the country. So I don't know that you have to. I mean, in that particular case, there may have been people who focused on race, who were reductionist in terms of class struggle and just focusing on that. But that doesn't mean that every time people focus on race rather than nationality, they're just reducing race to less important.
So I want to say what I think is super exciting about Harry Haywood's intervention here, right? So, yeah, it's the Haywood is the primary person getting the Comintern, drafting the Black Belt Thesis and getting the Comintern to choose it and vote for it. So there is an American who is part of this, and one. Two, it's really crucial to recognize that this cool thing about how the fact that the Comintern is intervening, right? I don't think that's a negative. I think that's one of the things that lets us see how global struggle can work to push, right? It's a nice sort of triangulated relationship. So that's the second point. Third point, what is so wonderful is the push to say, look, Black people did the work. They don't have to go away to be, have their kind of national self-determination somewhere else, right? Like the Garveyates were going to say, right? What does it mean to really say, no, you have the right to determine the future of this place, right? This is yours. I think that is an incredibly powerful thing to say. And that's what I think that the Black Belt Thesis did and why it's worth holding on to, and also why it was so powerful in the late 60s and early 70s that all sorts of radical groups were talking about it, investigating it, and debating it, is because of that power, right? It's very similar to the emancipatory politics of a number of groups in the late 70s.
Only Harry Haywood of like the Negro Comrades, that was for the Black Belt Thesis.
Yep.
But so Claudia Jones writes about this later, and so for the Black Belt to secede was an option. So what she said was the fight for full equal rights within the context of the United States was a choice, right? It wasn't antithetical to self-determination, but if Blacks chose to secede from the Union, that was their decision, and that was the essence of self-determination. It didn't mean that objectively that they had to. But the other critiques of the Black Belt Thesis was in 1914 or during World War I that there had already already been a great migration. And so there was a number of blacks who had moved out of the South, and as we know, by 1960, the South was the majority of blacks no longer lived in the South in that way. And so the question was, how do you account, because the party advocated the black belt thesis on the one hand, but then fight for full rights and integration in the North. And so I think that part of what Black Comrades were arguing was that to argue that blacks were a separate nation was to reify the worst aspects of Jim Crow logic, right? So one can argue that, okay, we built this thing, so we deserve to secede and have our own.
No, it doesn't mean deserve to secede. It's the way you said it earlier, right? I'm not saying that it's the choice. It's the choice. It's not the, it's not an argument for secession. It's an argument for the choice and the right to decide.
Right. And so anyway, I think that, but I also think that even the debate against the black belt thesis still shows a commitment of the Comintern to lifting up the Negro question, right, and to attempting to address it and to ameliorate those conditions. And I think what you said about the Comintern is true, that many black communists who joined the Communist Party joined the Comintern. They did not join the CPUSA initially. So like the African Blood Brotherhood, which then dissolved so that they can fully become part of the Comintern, was because, number one, black people have historically organized internationally, and number two, because of the endemic racism in the CPUSA. And black people were helping to create this theory. There's this understanding that they were the minions of communism, right? But they were helping to forge theory and to create theory, blacks in the United States and South Africa, et cetera, along with like Japanese communists, right? And so this idea that it's just this Eurocentric policy being imposed is not
correct, yeah.
Right, and so I think that, to make a short story long, that's like your kind of narration of the potentiality, I think, of comradeship. I'm not 100% sold, but I think that shows like the horizon, right? The possibility of comradeship.
Yeah, very much the horizon, yeah, for sure.
So I want to push on the shared expectations part. So the other thing, I agree with you that we shouldn't let people be too fuzzy about process to like get in the way of the kinds of specific suggestions you want to make, which is comradeship means you're in a party and you're going to meetings and you're doing shit, right? But the other thing when we look at actual party history that we have to confront is the consistent history of sectarianism, right? So anything from just the proliferation of different communist and socialist parties to real ideological splits, that happen over issues or over directions. So like if I'm in a local and we have beef with the national or with the Comintern or whoever, like am I comrades with them? If I'm just in a faction that's on the losing side of an ideological dispute that isn't about this or that protest, but is about this or that strategy, like on the level of black belt thesis, like does comradeship cut across those things? Like how can we tell? Is it does it just come back to the opposition that matters is proletariat versus capitalist, or is it?
I think that's a super interesting question. I've been asking people older than me, well, not that many at this point, right, because I'm pretty old, but I was talking with an Irish comrade who was in Sinn Féin, and also for a while she was in the South African Communist Party, and then briefly, she traveled a lot, so she was also briefly in, I think it was in the SWP in Ireland. And I asked her in the 60s and 70s, would the communist and the regular communists and the Trots call each other comrade? And she's like, no. But later, by the 80s and 90s, they would. And so that it changed over time. If you look at this volume that came out from Haymarket on Jay Lovestone and his comrades and about the Lovestone expulsion, like the Lovestonites, it's like they won't let them break up with them. They're like, no, and they still try to call each other comrade, all this sort of stuff, and all these texts. And then finally, you can see like about midway through the volume, they're just like Lovestone, and they stop calling them comrade. So you can look at in history changes over time. There's a wonderful text where C.L.R. James is leaving the editorial board of, what's it called? I can't remember the name. No, it begins with a C, not, it's one with James and Grace Lee Boggs, and he writes a letter to them where he's saying something like, anyone who continues to believe in, the basics of Marxism, et cetera, it will always be a comrade of mine. But those who will put aside this are no longer my comrades. So there's a kind of drama to the end of comradeship. One of my favorite examples is the trial of August Jokinen I think it's 1931. It happens in Brooklyn. Like 1,500 people come out for the Communist Party is going to expel this Finnish guy for not just white chauvinism, but they're saying he's complicit with lynch law and all the worst kinds of Jim Crow because he tried to keep a few black comrades from coming into a Finnish event. And during the trial, though, they continue to address him as comrade. He recognizes that he has violated the party line, that he has been guilty of complicity with Jim Crow, and he wants to stay within the party. What happens is the CP expels him, but what they say is you can come back in a year if you have worked really hard on selling the black paper, changed yourself, proven that you are, basically that you are a comrade. And so it's like, okay, this is good. There's a jury chosen from the audience. It's like, half black, half white. They all agree on this. So he's expelled, but then he gets deported. And the CP then leads the defense of him to try to keep him from being deported. So there's a kind of wonderfulness here of this imbrication of comradeship, non-comradeship, how is it unfolding? Yeah.
So this is kind of like a speculative question, but how do you feel about certain people on the left who say a phrase like diversity has been forced to us by capitalism?
I would say that racism is forced on us by capitalism.
No, but there are certain leftist groups who would say this phrase. Which ones?
Yeah, I will repeat, I would say that racism is forced on us by capitalism. And if we are going to have that essentially any class consciousness has to be a consciousness of all of the different, basically a consciousness of diversity. So if they're saying that, then they must they're not comrades.
So I'm just trying to anticipate another line of criticism, and I'm going to try to make the story really quick and not self-indulgent. But this morning I was looking for anti-royal wedding themes, and I came across this site that's the Jacobites who are still sore that a Catholic is not on the English throne. So there's all these memes, and I literally could not tell, is this a sincere alt-right neo-reactionary thing? Is this just somebody having a lark? Whatever. But I'm kind of wondering, it does seem to be a thing that communicative capitalism does, that it resurrects all these old forms for meme culture, and there's the level of irony, but there's also a level of sincerity to it, perhaps. And so, I know obviously we're all committed to a sort of ongoing struggle that can trace either coherent intellectual or organizational ties back to all the examples you're citing. But I'm just wondering what you would say to someone who's looking at a presentation that's mostly stuff from the 30s or from the even earlier, the 19-teens, and how would you sort of resist the accusation of, is this just more leftist melancholia, or is this just some sort of subcultural attempt to revive an old style in the new form? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So I would first say that a number of parties of the left do address each other as comrade. right? So globally, that's definitely true. I mean, there are big communist parties that do this. I will say, now this is a little bit off track, the Communist Party of China periodically has to pass edicts to tell people that, look, in the party we say comrade. One that happened in the last couple of years, they're like, look, in the party we say comrade, and you do not say buddy or bro. Don't say that. So, because like, that's what they say in the mafia, and that's what they say in markets, and we want to make sure there's a difference. So I think that the accusation that it's left nostalgia or melancholy, I just think that's empirically false. At the same time, I get what you're saying, right? I mean, there is a way, particularly in the U.S., that it can feel like, you know, like, oh, I'm being a commie fangirl or something like this, and there's not a real thing underneath. And then what I would want to say is that maybe that feeling lets us know the continued, and this goes back to what Philip was saying, that there's a continued affective resonance. That even if people aren't comfortable with it, even the irony notes that affective resonance is there. Because if not, the irony wouldn't work, right? You'd have to be able to, you've got to be able to detect it.
You know, but I think what's true about what you said in the second part is not in the word comrade, but when one talks about a war, and the images that come up are from the Western Front in World War I, whether it's the Douvre or whatever, when it's in a war with capitalism, that may be true, but it's an entirely new kind of thing that we're just trying to figure out, you know, how to even wage it. And to go back to thinking, you'll take an image from October, you know, and everybody will suddenly have guns with bayonets and they'll take over capitalism, and that's it. You know, or even something a little more complicated needs a lot more thinking. You know, and I think it's often in that militant pose of wanting to wage immediate war on capitalism, you show a certain nostalgia for a time when it was easier to grab.
In Seattle here, we have robust socialist discussions going on that have even become mainstream. We have strong, very strong democratic socialist organization, socialist alternative, very strong, socialist council member, many people running. And yet, when we had a young, powerful, lawyer, black woman running for office, chose to run under a new people's party, chose to form a new party. And so to me that says something about allyship, about comradeship, about intersectionality, about in terms of whose voices are being centered when you walk into a DSA meeting, when you walk into a socialist alternative meeting, and the process of trust, and it's not just trust, but let's use trust because I don't want to get into what I really mean by that, but the fact that we had a people's party that formed, to me, is speaking to like kind of all the question marks that came up throughout what you were saying in terms of even if this is like a utopian goal of what comradeship should be, I just don't know how it would be party building to use this frame with certain folks in Seattle to try to make them feel welcome in the party.
I'm not sure, because I don't know the context here very much, so I'm not sure about that. I mean, I don't know the context you're talking about.
No, it's absolutely true. It's a good depiction of the state.
And so we had an event 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago that was like the anniversary of the Black Panther Party here, and none of those folks are in this room.
Right.
And there's a reason for that. And the goals, the shared goals that you're talking about, the defined comradeship of anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, resistance, struggle, solidarity, all of the things are shared. So we're talking about shared political goals, but there's something getting in the way. And that something getting in the way is the fears of that erasure and homogenization that are coming up as a reaction to what you're saying.
So I think a couple of different things here. I think it is the responsibility of radical left parties to find the ways to make people welcome into their parties. I think that the interesting example of how the CP used the black belt thesis to attack white chauvinism, right? That's one of the major reasons that Harry Haywood wanted it instead of a thesis that was basically about race, that was going to subordinate it to the proletarian struggle. He wanted that thesis in order to fight white chauvinism within the Communist Party, right? And it was recognizing the histories of mistrust. Those haven't gone away. So it means it's incumbent on the parties to address that. So that would be full stop. I also think that one of the ways that happens is actually by having programs of kind of education and knowledge building, because it can also be the case that sometimes people attach themselves to the forms of politics that we get in online or in college and university settings to a particular kind of set of bourgeois norms and expectations. And that's one of the reasons that having a kind of educative process can also really help that too. So the party has to be able to be welcoming and mindful, but it also has to be the case that it doesn't just sort of blur into everything that's said online is somehow now the exact same thing. Does that make sense? Ish?
In the Chinese Communist Party, where everybody's obligated to say comrade.
It's passed as a I don't know, the edict's the wrong word, like an injunction or a requirement from time to time, yeah.
Does that include the billionaires?
It may, I'm not sure.
Comrade billionaire?
That's not the way the address usually goes, but.
I think maybe one more question and then probably have to get out of the building.
I don't think there are anymore, yeah? Oh, wait, there's right here, yeah. Here.
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, like, I do know there were several people at the Hampton conference who were here today at this lecture hall. But, I mean, I think we're kind of talking about two different conceptions of comradeship. Like, I don't envision people who vote for a socialist alternative to necessarily be comrades. I mean, I think, now I voted for both Shama and Nikita, but that doesn't mean I support everything they do in every way. But, I mean, like, just because you vote for someone doesn't make you a comrade. Again, like Jodi's saying, like, it's a method of inclusion within the party, right? So, like, we are dealing with, like, Seattle's white racist character, like, absolutely. But we also have to look at in, like, what moment and what kind of vein did Shama tap into? And she tapped into this sort of post-occupied milieu where there was a lot of, talk about class inequity and managed to maintain that. Meanwhile, actually, a year ago, Nikita made a speech at the King Hall where she actually distanced herself from the left and said that she was specifically not part of the left.
Right.
So, and again, I mean, I think I support Nikita and Shama in certain aspects, but there's also aspects where criticism should be more open and discussed. So.
Thanks. All right, thank you all.